Howdy, students, Shasta College students, Humanities 2. How you doing? It's Thursday, the 5th of November. What do you got planned for Thanksgiving? Well, we've got a month or so, a little over 6-7 weeks left of the class. And so we're going to go through some impressive eras of art and culture in this humanities class. We just got done with authors, and it's the best I could do with only giving each of these topics a week. Hope you had interesting times with it. Your papers, I assigned you papers, so no more papers. But there might be a discussion or two. That's always fun. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about 20th century painters. Now, I had covered some art already back in the 19th century. We did some Dutch painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer. Now I want to move in to what would be called modern painting and then postmodern painting. What's the difference? We'll talk about it. But before I go there, I want to briefly recover Vincent van Gogh, who was not a 20th century painter, but he was right on the cusp. He died in 1890, 10 years before the 20th century, by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He never quite fit into the world he lived in. He lived in mental anguish all his life, his young life, born in 1853. They made quite a few movies about him. Please check them out. They're wonderful. Maybe you've seen some film clips. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. There's even a great song, Starry, Starry Night, which is one of his famous paintings about him. He had a way with paint that nobody had ever seen before, and he kind of started the trend towards what would be called modern art, modern painting. The aesthetic was definitely not traditional. It wasn't realistic religious paintings like the paintings that came before him, or portraiture like Rembrandt was doing, or the everyday life in the kitchen and that Vermeer was doing. He was giving you an impression of what he sees and feels. And that doesn't mean it's a realistic photo-like painting of what he sees and feels. It's an impression. There was lots of painters starting to come into this sort of aesthetic. I can't cover them all. Monet would be another one. But we got to move through these pretty quickly. I'm going to be doing these guys, painters, until next week, and then we'll move on to some other topic. So today, for the next 15-20 minutes, I'll be talking about more painters. Are they predominantly men? Afraid so, folks. Women have had the short shift when it comes to most major art. Were they painters in these days? Absolutely. Were they selling in museums? Were they displaying in galleries? Most likely not. They painted in the shadow of a male-dominated world. That's an interesting topic for somebody to write their paper about. Speaking of paper, we're down to, I think we have 1 or 2 more essays. We're going to go to 7 essays. That was announced a couple weeks ago, plus it's in the syllabus now. And then we got your journal, hopefully you're keeping. We're going to have a quiz probably in a couple more weeks based on everything we've covered, a lot of what we've covered, not everything, or some of what we've covered. And it will be a take-home test that you can use your notes and my lectures, but you'll have a limited amount to do it. You'll probably have 12 hours to complete it. But that's later. Don't worry about it now. And then you're going to have one final research paper that you choose the topic. And it'll be a topic. I would start looking at it right now. choose a topic of something we've covered. We started in Florence with modern plumbing, and we started with writers like Shakespeare and um, painters and musicians like Mozart and the blues artists and Nirvana. And we've gone up to, I don't have to recap it all, but you know what we've been doing. Last 2 weeks, we did writers, literature. And now we're going to be doing painters. We're going to be doing design of buildings and architecture, which is really, if you don't think it's fascinating, well, every day you go into a building, how do you feel about it? You live in a shelter, I hope, or you live in a van. That'd be cool too. How do you feel about that? Does it make you feel? Have you ever been to a historical building? Have you ever been in New York City, Boston, Paris, London? Have you ever walked around old buildings? Does it mean anything? Do you get a feeling when you see these buildings, or do you get nothing? Or do you like modern buildings, glass structures? Do you like what they're doing in downtown Reading? We could talk about that. Are those buildings inspiring? Do they inspire? Are they forward thinking, or is it just the same old, same old? We could talk about that. Buildings are us, folks, because we exist in them and we're around them. We're driving around them. We're parking next to them. We're going in them. We're eating in restaurants once the pandemic's over. We're living in them. So we're worshiping in them. We're going to movies in them. Of course, not during the pandemic. So buildings are really, really a huge key to who we are as a culture. And so we'll be going through that. And then we're going to hit cinema pretty good, probably 2 weeks of that, and I don't know what else after that. We'll see. Maybe ballet, dance. Who's into dance? It has changed a lot of things. Have you ever seen a dance? Have you ever seen a ballet? Anyway, we'll talk. We'll get to all those things eventually, so you can write a term paper. It's going to be the last final paper. It'll be a research paper, not a critical essay, and you can pick the topic. You got to run it by me. Just say, I want to write about whatever you want to write about, and I'll say yay or nay. And then you go do your research paper. And we'll talk about, that'll be due the last week of school. The journal is going to be due the last week of school. So don't worry about any of this stuff yet. I don't know when the last week is. I'd have to look at the dates, but I think it's in the middle of December sometime, which is about 6 weeks from now. They go by fast, folks. Okay, I'll shut up about that because I want to talk about some of these artists. Van Gogh is important to talk about, even though he's on the cusp of the 20th century. And I think I mentioned him earlier. He was born in the Netherlands. He's a Dutch painter. Another one of those Dutch painters. Why was so many Dutch painters of this era affected? Because they lived in a port city. If you've ever been to Rotterdam, it's a major port city where lots of travelers are coming through, lots of product is coming through, and they're successful towns. This was a time that these cities, these Northern European cities, were thriving. The goods and services were coming through their ports, and they were spending money there, and it was a pretty good life. The only thing that was lacking really was modern health. There still was no antibiotics or penicillin or anything that keeps us alive now. So sometimes if you got sick, you died early. Life expectancy was a lot earlier than it is now because of modern medicine, because of lack of modern medicine. Anyway, so Van Gogh came up in an environment where he didn't really start painting until he only painted for 10 years, folks. He didn't start painting until in his 20s. He took some lessons, and literally, whether you believe in God or not, doesn't matter, but he felt he was being instructed by a higher force than himself to paint. And paint he did. He painted a lot of paintings. 1,000 plus. That's a lot of work. He didn't stop working. He was obsessed with it, and he didn't connect to people. They said he was probably bipolar before we knew what that was. He could have been schizophrenic before we knew how to have medication for it, which he probably was. Because sometimes he was not lucid, and sometimes he was hallucinating, and he was in and out of mental. Yes, they had mental institutions in those days, but they were mostly kind of places to be confined in, not to get therapy to figure out what's going on. And like I said, there was no modern psychotic drugs to treat you. They did it in pretty crude fashion that might have done more harm than good. And he was a victim of all of that. He had a very loyal brother, Leo, who supported him financially. And in Picasso's lifetime, he was kind of a joke in the community because he was considered eccentric. He was always off in the woods, out in the fields, the farm fields, and he was painting like crazy. And these paintings did not sell in his lifetime. He was not considered successful at all. And his brother, Leo, is one of the only people that ever bought one of his paintings, mostly out of pity. But they were very loving brothers, and they exchanged a lot of letters. There's a great book. I suggest you read it. The letters between the two brothers. And in those days, folks, all we do is text now, LOL, and smiley faces and all the usual pop culture nonsense. They actually wrote thoughtful narrative style letters that actually told a story of not just their lives, but of the times they were living in. And they sent them through the old fashioned way. A postal man had to deliver them. So it took time. It took time to write the letters, to compose the letters, and to mail the letters. And that slows everything down. It makes you contemplate. It makes you want to express yourself fully, not just in little snippets of LOL and happy face emojis like we do now. And when you got a letter, you received a letter, it meant everything. You spent days reading over, poring over it, because they're that deep, and that people were literate, folks, and they wanted to make it right. And that's how they told their stories. This is before we had a phone, so you couldn't call somebody up with the phone, before internet, before YouTube, social network, everything. Things were slower then. So, Van Gogh is painting some of the most iconic paintings in our world that exist to this day. They're priceless. You can't put a price on a Van Gogh. If you can't afford it. I had the privilege to go to Amsterdam, and I went to, besides the Rijksmuseum, which is where I saw the Vermeers, and I saw the Rembrandts. I suggest you do that one day. I also, down the block from there was the Van Gogh Museum, when it's all Van Gogh's painting, and it's an incredible place because you can't believe the amount of work he did and how iconic it is, how much you've seen this work. Now, they've reduced it now, folks, to Hallmark cards and calendars, to where it's almost like a human being didn't create these, computer did, but a human being did. And you might recognize some of these images. Even you might not study art, you might not know anything about it, but I think you'll recognize a Van Gogh image. What else do I say? When they lift the travel ban, you guys need to go to Paris. You need to go to the Louvre. You need to go to Spain, the Prada, and you need to go to the museum, the Van Gogh Museum. And then you're going to write me a letter in 5 years when you do go, hey, Professor, I went, you were right. Anyway, if you need to get out of town, they're not bad places to go. But he couldn't connect with people. He fell in love with a woman, possibly a prostitute. We don't know all the details, but he was known to hang out with prostitutes, but he was not successful with them. He's shy and shut down, didn't have much money, and maybe he was mumbling to himself. Maybe he wasn't too clean, but he always has his paintings with him. And supposedly, the myth goes that he fell in love with a woman, and she did not. It was unrequited love, meaning it wasn't reciprocated. And supposedly, he cut off his ear as a form of self-inflicting pain on himself, but also to punish her. Put it in an envelope, sent it to her. He didn't cut his whole ear off, folks. It was only partially cut off. And we still don't know 100% the facts on that. It's just thought that's what he was doing. A romantic gesture in the ultimate extreme. Then he was having many mental issues, like I told you, and he decided to end it all. Shot himself in the chest, and he couldn't even kind of accomplish that right. And it took him several days to die, folks. And all of a sudden, later on, his paintings were discovered. He was dead. Maybe that's why they always say dead painters sell more than living painters, because there's not going to be any more painting coming. It's a limited supply. But he painted so many, it was a lot of paintings still out there. And now they're in every museum in the world. People from all over the planet go to the museums to see his paintings and to experience them. And there's a sad melancholy on it because of the way he died. Absolutely. It's part of the myth. You can't divorce the myth from the work. So it's just like Jim Morrison and the Doors. It's like Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. It's hard to divorce the myth of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana and their death. Same with the Doors and other artists throughout our time. It hangs heavy on the work. And so you know this about Van Gogh. So I'll post some stuff on YouTube. You'll see. I'll post it on Canvas for you guys. Anyways, but coming into the 20th century, we've got a guy named Pablo Picasso. Maybe you've heard of him. I think I may mention him in another lecture, but not in very much detail. Picasso is arguably the most famous painter in the world. Born in Spain, 1881, lived a long life, just to 1973, lived into modern times. Pretty modern, not for you maybe, but for everybody else, 1973. And he painted and sculpted like no one's ever seen before. Once again, I had the good fortune to be in Spain to see where most of his work is housed. And going through those rooms, it's an incredible body of work. It's hard to believe one man did all that. And from their different periods of his life, when he's happy, when he's sad, his blue period, as they call it, where all the paintings had a blue tint because he had lost a friend to suicide, to his sculptures, to his bizarre, strange nudes with women with 3 eyes and their heads are different and they have 3 or 4 breasts. He painted what he saw in his mind's eyes. And it was a distortion of reality, but not a distortion of emotional reality. And that's what he captured. That's not easy to do, folks. And when you see his stuff, and I know hopefully you've seen some of this stuff and on T-shirts or calendars or a movie or something. He's out there. His paintings are out there. His famous ones are very much out there, and even his not so famous ones are pretty original and awesome. He was very, very famous in his lifetime. He moved to France early on. He felt more accepted there. Although he was obsessed with bullfights, he still loved to see a good old bullfight in Spain. And then during World War II, he was very, very famous already. The Nazis occupied Paris, and he was not a happy camper. Nobody was, but he lived through it. And I think I mentioned this on another lecture. He had the Spanish Civil War broke out in about 1936. They're trying to, the Patriots, or I would say the Democratic movement, was trying to get rid of the dictator Franco, and they staged a revolution. They lost big time, folks, because Franco had Hitler on his side. Hitler sent in airplanes, which was kind of new to warfare in those days, and they dropped bombs on the Spanish civilians. And one of Picasso's famous paintings, Guernica, is a depiction of the horror of being bombed. That it's a black and white, folks, black and white and grays. When you see it, sit in front of it, sit there for an hour, and just wonder at the. It's huge. The vastness, it takes up a whole room. The vastness, the story, the terror, the beauty, the desperate will to live, but being murdered brutally. And he captured all that in a painting. Think about it. Lived a ripe old life, I guess, to 90. Like I said, he was well off. He was very financially secure when he died, and he knew he was a genius, and he was sprightly and engaged in the world right up till the time he died. I want to talk about two more real quick, and then that's it for tonight. During another Dutch painter, Willem de Kooning, came out of the Netherlands, immigrated to the United States, very much influenced by Picasso, Monet, and other what they were calling impressionists. With Picasso, now we're talking about abstract impressions, because they're not realistic depictions of the human form. Well, this greatly influenced him. He studied. He studied with Gorky, who was another immigrant from another country, Armenian, and Gorky taught classes in New York City, and a gathering. This would be in the 1930s, and the gathering of these would-be artists, future artists, gathered around, and they painted. They changed the face of modern painting. They came into this movement. It would be called abstract realism. Sometimes there's no figures in it. It's not people. They've gone away from the figurative to solely expression of an emotion through paint and color and brush strokes. Gorky and de Kooning were great friends, drinking buddies. These guys drank like major alcoholics that they were. Gorky had a bad time. He physically had a really bad, harsh time. And this is long before modern medicine. But there was modern medicine, but not like we have today. And they had to remove half of his stomach, half of his bowels. And for the last couple of years of his life, he had a colostomy bag. He was a macho, totally macho European man who liked to smoke and drink and have sex with a lot of women. Now that's over because of his condition. He never really got over it, and he went out to the barn one night and hung himself. I also was in Spain in the San Picasso's museum. There's a lot of Gorkys there too. Fascinating man. Totally, they called him the Dark Angel. He looked like a rock star, and his vision of humanity was dark. De Kooning went on his own and broke away from the style of Gorky and created his own style. And it changed. It was a revolution. I know I don't say that lightly, but that's what we're covering in this class. The groundbreakers, from the writers to the movie directors, when we go to it, to the architects. We're talking about the radical revolutionaries who changed everything and twisted it into a new direction. De Kooning got very, very famous in the 1950s. He came out of World War II. He didn't fight World War II; he was too old, but he was affected by the war, and like everybody else, and he became a very, very successful painter in New York, Greenwich Village, and was always seen frequenting the bars, of course, with other fellow artists of the time. One would be Jackson Pollock. They had who was actually born out here near Chico, and Pollock was back there trying to make his mark. They were in the same realm, the abstract realism. Pollock was doing what he called the drip paintings, where he would drip paintings onto a canvas, not brush them on with the brush, let it drip off his paintbrush. And if you ever go to MoMA in New York, please do. That's the Modern Art Museum. You'll see a Jackson Pollock up close. We're not talking about little drips here, folks. We're talking about 500,000 drips of different patterns and colors, to where it looks like a psychotic madness of emotion. He got very famous also, made some money. They both moved out to Long Island so they can have studios where they can have barns and they can really go crazy with the painting. He was a severe alcoholic. They made a really good movie called Pollock with Ed Harris. He was his own worst enemy, had lots of issues with drink. He knew he was a genius, but I think he was a victim of his genius, whereas de Kooning relaxed into it and didn't fight as much, and he was more equipped for the fame that came his way. And he painted until he died of dementia in like early 1990s. He was old age, and he was still after looking for some truth in painting. And that's what that's what art is all about. Truth. Now, is it truth? Is it universal truth? Is it their truth, your truth, my truth? Hopefully it's truth that we all recognize. De Kooning sort of got healthy, was riding his bicycle and to the barn to paint every day out in Long Island. Now you really can't afford to live out there, folks, anymore. The Hamptons and all that is just for the uber rich. But Pollock found a place out there he could buy, he can afford. And they both had strong wives who were also painters. And they're very brilliant in their own right. And they backed their man up. They supported their man no matter what. Through thick and thin, and the men put them through hell eventually, essentially. Because it's hard. It's hard to live with a genius who knows they're a genius. Rembrandt knew he was a genius. So did Mozart. So did Beethoven. So did Picasso. Van Gogh didn't. And that's a huge difference. And they were rewarded. They were rewarded for their genius. Van Gogh wasn't, at least not in his lifetime. And it does matter. You want to have some recognition being alive. Because when you're dead, who's the recognition for? Okay, so they had strong women who had to put up a lot of crap from these guys. Jackson was constantly looking at other women. He took off on a drive with 2 women in a car on Long Island, totally drunk out of his mind, driving like a maniac in a convertible. And yes, folks, he may have committed suicide with them in the car with him by ramming into a tree. He was killed instantly. One of the women survived. The other woman died. So he was a tortured artist. He's like the definitive tortured artist. De Kooning wasn't like that. He just drank his depression away. And he made a lot of money, and he stayed relevant his whole life. And that's not easy to do. So for 50 years, he was relevant and very respected. And then I'll end on this note. A new group of painters started in the 1950s. Andy Warhol's one of them. And they kind of rejected these guys. And they came up with their own art, which was defined later as pop art. On that note, pop art, next time I see you all, watch the lecture, keep up on your essays, keep up on your journals. We're getting there. We're getting to the end. And when this is all over, go to a museum. There's a great one in San Francisco. There's a couple in San Francisco. The De Young and the Modern Museum. They're wonderful. They have world-class art there. And it's only 4 hours away from Reading. There's a great museum in Portland, Oregon, which is a little further. It's I lived in Portland and went to the museum many times. And I am a filmmaker and a musician. I like activity in my art viewing, but when you go to the museum, you see the power of art and how it moves you. In the 50s, 60s, they reframed the name and they called it Action Abstract Painting. I'll explain all that later. Anyway, because there is action, folks, not only in the work, but in the painter doing the work. On that happy note, talk to you later. Next lecture, next week. Good luck. Enjoy your weekend. It's going to get cooler, maybe even rain. Good luck. Stay safe.